Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. Is the United States attempting regime change in Venezuela? On Tuesday, the U.S. Navy's largest warship, the Gerald Ford, took up a new position in the Caribbean after leaving the Middle East 3 weeks ago. It comes amid Washington's biggest military buildup in the region in decades. In a moment, we will examine what the Trump administration wants to accomplish in Venezuela and how that fits into its broader strategy for Latin America. As always on FP Live, we've gotten loads of subscriber questions from around the world. I will channel them and I will use a few directly. If you want to join in, become a subscriber now. You can get 50% off on your first payment. We are also a free podcast. Just find us wherever you get your audio. One more plug. We have an Ask Me Anything episode coming up. Send in your questions right here on the site or by emailing us at live@foreignpolicy.com. Okay, so for 2 months now, the United States has been striking boats off of Venezuela's coast because, according to the White House, of concerns about narco-terrorism. There's little evidence that the bombings, in which 76 people have been killed so far, were actually hitting drug traffickers. But even so, there is a broad belief that what the Trump administration really wants here is to topple Nicolas Maduro, the leader of Venezuela. This is a dynamic situation and there's lots to explore. I am curious about how Latin American countries are reacting. Many of them have their own problems with Maduro, of course. And it's worth asking how all of this fits into the White House's broader regional strategy. Countries like Brazil and Argentina are, of course, far apart in how they're navigating Trump's America First, and we will examine why. Joining me now is Oliver Stuenkel, just back from the region. He writes frequently about Latin America for FP. Oliver is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an associate professor at the School of International Relations at FGV in Sao Paulo. Oliver, welcome to FP Live.
Thank you, Ravi. It's great to be with you for this debate.
Pleasure to have you on. So let's start with Venezuela. This is quite a military buildup on Washington's part. What do you think the White House wants here?
Well, everybody is speculating, of course, also in Latin America. I would say for now, everything suggests that the Trump administration is seeking to scare Maduro into resigning, perhaps. I think that there's still a lot of concern in Washington about potential unintended consequences of having boots on the ground. A significant part of the Trump electorate, I think, is very wary about military entanglement with uncertain exit strategies. So I think there's two factions in the White House. I think the MAGA faction, led by people like Rick Grenell, are very reluctant to use force to remove Maduro from power and have actually sought to negotiate directly with the Venezuelan president, seek to cut a deal, guarantee that the United States has access to Venezuelan oil. But at the same time, we have a faction led by Marco Rubio, who, of course, also thinks about his long-term political career, may have presidential ambitions, and being the Secretary of State on whose watch regime change actually happened, on whose watch the Maduro regime ended, would of course be electorally beneficial. So I think there's these competing groups. And of course, it's important to keep in mind that Trump has tried to promote or to remove Maduro from power indirectly during the first term, has failed to do so. And I think that now this is sort of a second iteration with a much stronger military presence, but few signs that the United States is willing to actually engage militarily. And perhaps the primary goal right now is to create a situation in which internally there will be a movement, perhaps of a general seeking to move against Maduro, or the population rising up against the dictatorship.
And meanwhile, Venezuela is also mobilizing its military. It has S-300s, for example, fairly sophisticated long-range missile systems. But Oliver, I mean, there's a long history of how interventions in the region attempts at regime change, they rarely work exactly as planned. What is your sense of, what the plan is? Were Maduro to accept asylum somewhere? Were he to fall? What happens there? Is there enough clear thinking on the what next?
I think many who support regime change in Venezuela perhaps think about Panama in 1989 when the United States mobilized about 27,000 troops to remove General Noriega from power. That was a fairly simple operation, and Panama has been a stable democracy since. And yet, of course, these are profoundly different countries. I think that the Venezuelan regime has been in power for decades. It's essentially a military-led government. The military has tremendous power, and I think the opposition is very much sidelined. I think opposition leaders know that without U.S. pressure, they will not be able to topple Maduro, who's very much consolidated, I think, and very little incentive for the armed forces to move against him, in part because it's very unclear of what transitional justice would look like. I mean, if you're part of the Venezuelan military leadership, it's important to think about what are your incentives to give in to U.S. pressure, in part because I think the Venezuelan assessment is also that Trump is not somebody who wants to tackle a particular issue for a long time. So he may just move on after a couple of weeks or months, as he has ultimately done in 2019, when we had this high point of pressure and there were large-scale protests against the government in Venezuela. Guaido was being recognized as the legitimate leader by many countries in the West, and in the end, the West abandoned Guaido, and Maduro remained in power. So I think the Venezuelan regime's bet is that will happen again, that Trump's attention span is very limited. And yes, I think there's not enough thought being given to post-Maduro scenarios. A lot could happen. I mean, you could have the military substituting Maduro by someone who basically keeps the regime in place. That may be sufficient for Trump to actually move on and say we've removed Maduro. I think there's very little interest in making sure that Venezuelan democracy would flourish after an operation like that. Then, of course, you could have the scenario of the opposition leader, Corina Machado, coming to power and Venezuela actually democratizing. But you could also have a scenario of
she's the one who
conflict.
won the Nobel Peace Prize recently, but is in hiding, we're told.
Exactly. But you could also have internal conflict. The Maduro government is not in control of the entire territory in Venezuela. So groups of organized crime are controlling parts of the south. I mean, you could have a breakdown. And then, of course, you have the United States potentially having to engage in a more long-term fashion, which is exactly what Trump doesn't want to do. I think right now the bet is that this kind of outside pressure, mostly symbolic, weakens Maduro sufficiently, in part because direct intervention, military intervention, would inevitably delegitimize the incoming government because it would be seen as dependent on the United States. But also it's important to keep in mind that even if successful, quote unquote, a U.S. intervention in Venezuela could have massive consequences for U.S.-Latin America relations more broadly, because the kind of justification that Trump is using could easily be applied to other countries. So naming Maduro, a drug trafficker, is, something that's controversial, to say the least. It's not clear how directly he is actually involved in drug trafficking in the country. And Venezuela is not even a major source of drugs coming to the United States. So that could then lead for the United States to apply that to other countries. So a lot of concern among armed forces in the region. And certainly you'd have, I think, a rally around the flag effect in countries and an attempt to diversify ties, further seek closer ties to countries like China. At the same time, Maduro is far more isolated now than he was during the first Trump administration. So there's a bit of a tension there because very few countries in Latin America are ready to sort of actively defend Maduro. So it's a bit of a dilemma for leaders like Lula, who of course want
In
to make
Brazil.
sure that Venezuelan sovereignty is respected, but they don't want to be seen as too close to Maduro, who's not particularly well liked across the region, especially now that Lula is preparing his re-election campaign next year. He doesn't want to be seen as a Maduro ally.